Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wise Up, a finance podcast made by and for Gens Y and Z to help you be better with money. I hope you all enjoyed your Labor Day weekends. We're back, and I'm very, very glad to be joined by Professor James Aaron Brown. Aaron, how are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. So for those who are not aware of your work, I've followed you for a while. You are a professor of business and finance at North Central University in Colorado, correct?
It's not in Colorado. It's in San Diego, but I get to live from Colorado and teach online. So I teach in our graduate and doctoral programs at North Central.
Exciting. So one of the ways that I first discovered your work was actually you have a Thursday Gen Z update.
Yeah.
I think you just call it Thursday update. It's your weekly newsletter. That's how I discovered your work, and I thought you'd be a perfect fit for the podcast because you focus on it. So on that topic, I think that's a great segue. What got you interested in talking about Gen Z and finance?
Sure. So I was working on my doctorate in strategic leadership. Back in 2018, 2019, I started the dissertation phase. And so I was originally going to work with a nonprofit here in Colorado Springs that was relaunching and revamping its services and what it provided to people, and thought I was going to do the organizational analysis and lead the change. And then suddenly I discovered that someone else had been hired to do that. I was like, I was free. They decided to hire somebody. So they went that route, and I locked that in as my dissertation. And so I was like, scrambling a little bit because you don't really want to go to your chair of your dissertation and do a change. And so I ended up going to my chair and doing a change, and wanted to explore the topic of Gen Z with another nonprofit here in the Colorado Springs area. And to make an incredibly long story short, I ended up developing this talk that I did here in Colorado Springs on cultural influences on Generation Z and what is shaping them from a historical perspective and into the future. And so that's what got me started in it. I also work with another nonprofit with millennials and do some consulting there. So yeah, it's all kind of a wheelhouse for me.
So basically everything Gens Y and Z you do. If it's
I try.
So can I assume that you're also an older millennial, or?
I am an old millennial. So I am 38 and born in 83. I'll be 39 here in about 2-3 weeks. And I am one of the first millennials. So I also fall in, there's a technical term called cusper. And that word cusp means you're born at the end of another generation and beginning of another generation. So I share qualities of Gen X while also sharing qualities of millennials as well. So as I developed and worked with the framework that I ended up working with for my dissertation, I was like, oh, that's me. And that's me. And that's me. That's not me. And that's me. So that was some of the realizations that I had around that.
So I've never heard of a cusper. That kind of makes sense because even in my own life, I was trying to figure out, am I Gen Z or Y? Because I'm in 98. And officially the cutoff, I think, is 96 for the end of the millennials. Mm-hmm. So whenever I was looking, I'm like, I'm an older Gen Z, I think.
You are.
But yeah, the cusper.
You're me, just in your generational location.
I'm a you. I look at it and go, I see the traits with the millennials here. Some Gen Z traits, look at it and go, why? Why are we doing that? Yeah. I'm not with them on this one.
and those years when millennials end and Gen Z starts, they're a little tricky. I think Jean Twenge, she authored a book called iGen. And she was the early Gen Z author. So she works out of San Diego University. PhD from Stanford. She's at San Diego University, and wrote one of the first books. She also wrote one of the best books on millennials as well. But she, and I agree with her, and probably I agree with her because I used her work for my dissertation. But I agree with her at a start of 1996, and the reason is that you don't want to just arbitrarily pick years to say when a generation begins and ends. You kind of have to wait several years to say, well, what is the most impactful event on a generation? And her and others would say that the advent of the iPhone and smartphone technology and social media is really the big impact and social shaper. I would also say the 2008 financial crisis is a huge shaper. So you go to, what is it, 2007, 2006, 2007 with the advent of the iPhone, 2006, you end up with Facebook expanding its reach outside of college universities to just everyday people, and the launch of Twitter as well. So I think those things are much more impactful on a generation. So when you do that and you go back, you're like, okay, if that's the case, then Gen Z is 11 or 12 when these things start to happen, and they're at the right age location for these things to be impactful on their formation. There's a ton of other things that we could walk through that would inform that. But some people will say, oh, 9/11, that deeply impacted Gen Z. No, I mean, if they're born in 96, if Gen Z is born in 96, then that means they're 5 at the latest when 9/11 happens. 9/11 impacted me. It didn't impact Gen Z. And most Gen Z are born 2000, 2001, 2002. So yeah. That was a long-winded response to your very simple question. So
we do love doing that in academia, but you are right. And as for the book iGen, I also cited it in the process of getting my master's degree when we were discussing user-generated content and its effect on people. And that was my first real foray, let's call it, into the effects of social media onto the formation of Gen Zs.
Yeah.
And the entire concept of mental health issues, anxiety, depression, all of the associate things that we're now finally starting to talk about in broader society. But you bring up an excellent point on the impacts of social innovations on different generations.
Sure.
As you were mentioning, iPhone, I think, came out in 2007. I believe that's the accurate date. And I remember I was in first grade, I want to say, in 2005. And Facebook, I had friends then, Lord Almighty, going back to first grade, my memory, who were switching from MySpace to Facebook at the time.
MySpace. And yeah, that's where I go to have alone
shift
now. So,
so I remember these shifts and the 2008 financial crisis. I can't say that I remember vividly because it didn't really impact me.
Right.
I remember it happening. I remember the stories. I remember Occupy Wall Street being on the news, but I don't remember being directly impacted by it. I remember the iPhone. I remember Twitter, all of the other things. I remember Instagram popping up and then Snapchat. And transitioning, I think that's a good segue, where the 2008 financial crisis was largely not impactful for younger people, for Gen Zs, and even younger millennials, let's call them, people who are 27, 28 right now.
Sure.
Our memories of it are very mild at best. We might have seen the impacts on our parents, parents, friends, whomever, but it didn't directly impact us. So now that economies are seemingly, talks of a recession occurring every other week or so, and there's a concern, I think the reason why it's having so much of an impact is because there's such a large subset of the population who's never experienced it directly. Sure. Where now you have older Gen Zs who are done with college like me, who are in the workforce, the younger millennials, even the older millennials who are in the workforce now. So it now, for the first time, has the opportunity to directly impact them. Yes. So it's a very new experience for them. So in your classrooms, in your discussions, what are you noticing about attitudes of the students that you're dealing with?
Sure. So most students that I work with are what we would call adult learners. So lots of my students are like age 40 and above. So 40 to 60, they've decided to go back, get their MBA, or go back and earn their doctorate for some type of career advancement. In the nonprofit circles that I've worked in with Gen Z, it's really interesting. I mean, especially Gen Z who are willing to give their time to the nonprofit space, serving, things like that. There is this altruism that I think millennials have talked about, but Gen Z actively participates in. And so, just to diss my fellow millennials for a few minutes, we grew up in a way where we were told very much so how wonderful we are and how we are going to change the world and all of those good things. And so to some degree, we wholeheartedly bought into it. I think there is truth to the jokes about, hey, I've been here at my new job for 2 weeks. Why am I not a manager? Why am I not CEO? Why am I not running this place? What's going on? And I think there's truth to that. And if you look at generational cycles, it makes sense. We have the title of civic heroes, and we do drive a lot of change. And we're seeing that now, even with politics. We're seeing more millennials enter politics. So, I mean, we have the Ocasio-Cortezes compared to the Dan Crenshaws, who are leading the way for millennials. But there is a reality with Gen Z that whatever millennials are, Gen Z is just a little bit more. So whatever values millennials hold, Gen Z tends to hold much more. So I think that we are seeing especially much more, some people might call it progressive ideology. And I think that we see that Gen Z is probably the most progressive generation that we have had. And I think that some of that plays out more in their altruism. So we're seeing a lot of Gen Z get more involved in politics at an earlier stage. My last Thursday Gen Z update that I did on LinkedIn, I talked about the political climate that Gen Z is actively participating in. So I just see a greater altruism, I think, with Gen Z, where I think millennials, their minds are more in the political change process. And this is going to sound very paradoxical and contradictory, but where millennials are like trying to drive change at higher levels, I think Gen Z is more grassroots with their change, if that makes sense.
That does. And I was going to comment that I believe it was your last Thursday update that was about the progressive wave.
Yeah.
I think it was not quite that term that you used, but similarly.
Sure.
And that was interesting for me because I remember when I was getting my undergraduate degree in political science, the research that was coming out then about Gen Zs were that they were going to be the most conservative generation since the boomers as I don't want to call it a retaliation, but as a reversal from the millennials.
Yeah.
And
sure. Well, I think
believe even.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, let me not cut you off.
No, just to finish off, it was more so that they were going to be more socially progressive, but in terms of finances, more conservative, more small government, in that sense of the word. So when you are talking about the altruism and progressiveness, do you believe that applies also to the economic policies or the social aspects or all of it?
That's a great question. So to your point, and I remember seeing those studies as well come out about Gen Z will be the reddest generation. And I was like, I'm very skeptical of this. But I think to your point, yes, socially, Gen Z is more progressive than millennials. But I think economically, Gen Z is more conservative to some degree than millennials. We do see where Gen Z is more comfortable with bigger government than previous generations. They're at least on par a little bit more than millennials. I think there are good indicators that Gen Z is more financially, what's the word I'm looking for, financially focused and financially conservative and conscious than their predecessors. So what I mean by that is my father-in-law is a baby boomer, and he helps people get reverse mortgages. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding around reverse mortgages, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. There were also bad deals around lots of mortgages in general. So this is not a pitch for reverse mortgages, but just trying to create some insight on this. So what we find with baby boomers in general is that they are running out of money and they refuse to slow down. They have this inherent value system inside of them that says, I have worked hard all my life and I deserve to be retired and to have all of these nice things. Problem is, they're not going to be able to afford it much longer because they're living longer than their parents lived. And to some degree, I don't think that anybody anticipated that. So we see baby boomers who spend money much more rapidly than we might think. Gen X has tended to be a little bit more conservative because Gen X, they're kind of caught in the middle, especially if they have parents who are baby boomers. So they find themselves taking care of their parents while also trying to prepare their children for life outside of the home. So whether that be college, trade school, or just going into the workforce. A lot of Gen Xers still just have teenage Gen Z children. Millennials, we kind of share some of that baby boomer mentality, and it makes sense. Baby boomers heavily influence millennials. They are our parents for the most, to the most degree. But what we see in that is millennials would rather spend money on experiences than assets like homes, things like that. And up until the recent interest rate drop, millennials weren't as able to get into the housing market until those interest rates dropped to 2-3%, something like that. Now, bringing this full circle because I'm incredibly long-winded. What we're seeing with Gen Z, so I'm going to disagree a little bit with a statement that you made just a few minutes ago. Where I'll disagree is that Gen Z, depending on their age location, did see their parents struggle through the 2008 financial crisis. On top of that, many Gen Z have parents who are Gen X. So I think Gen X is probably the most shafted generation that we have had because they constantly, just as they catch steam, there's some type of financial crisis that always forces them to take a hit. So whether it's Black Monday in 1988, or the 2001 recession, or the 2008 financial crisis, just as they're getting steam, there's always something that affects them. Well, Gen Z has grown up with them as parents. And so they are gleaning this attitude of, I need to be really careful about how I spend money. And I think some of the ways that we're seeing this is, one, Gen Z has heavily influenced the gig economy. So millennials have traditionally loved the gig economy. It's kind of the world that we live in now. We just paved the way for it where we don't want to go to the office. Netflix helped drive this economy where if you were a computer programmer, you could take contracts for 6 months and then just re-up or move on to a new company. Gen Z says the opposite. They say we want stability and we'd really like to work in an office and be mentored by professionals. The other thing, and this news just came out probably 3 or 4 months ago, but the FAFSA. So for any listeners that may be unfamiliar with this, FAFSA is what you file for financial aid to go to college, because we know that college is really expensive. And so this past year, there were 339,000 fewer applications for financial aid, which means there are over 300,000 fewer traditional students entering undergraduate college. And I think a lot of that is driven by, I need to be more financially responsible. And it's, if I'm not going into accounting or nursing or something medical, something that will get me a job right out of college, I should probably go do something else so that I don't incur all of this debt. So I think there's actually a lot of indicators that Gen Z will continue to be a financially responsible generation. I think one of the questions will be, what do they choose to do for retirement? And that's something I really haven't seen as far as, is there a trend in mutual funds like a Vanguard index or a Fidelity or something like that, or some type of 401k that they could direct themselves. So I think that's the information that's missing. Robinhood cannot fill that gap with fractional shares. So, and also the discipline just to continue to invest in those funds. I'm not seeing that trend or data out there right now.
You brought up a lot of very interesting points. I'll address the most recent one first. In the comment about Gen Z's preferring the in-person workplace.
Sure.
I believe that I directly cited you because that was a Thursday update directly before my first podcast with Dr. Joe Fitter, where I said we were discussing the FIRE movement and the return to the office that most companies are doing, and I brought up your work on how
from
what you were seeing.
First newsletter I think that I put out. Yeah,
it was news to me because all that I had been hearing or seeing was also people. Yeah, the exact joke I make was, I think, that every CNBC article for the past 5 months has been expat living off the coast of Mazatlan, you're living on $500 a month, whatever it is. And your newsletter came out, and it was, no, Gen Zs by and large are preferring in-person mentorship, experiences. And I was astounded by that because we hadn't really been seeing that. But logically, it made sense. Just because the last 2 or so years, let's just say, so for a lot of young, middle-aged Gen Zers, I don't even know what to call them. For a lot of Gen Zers, that was the end of their high school years. Might have been their entire junior and senior year of high school. Might have been their first year of college.
Yeah.
So wanting those in-person experiences makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Wanting human connection, human experiences made sense.
Sure.
So were you surprised by that, or were you expecting that as well?
Wasn't surprised by it. I don't think it was necessarily on my radar until it started coming about. So I think there's 2 or 3 ideas that we can talk about around why would Gen Z want to work in the office, since they're the most digitally connected, internet native generation. Like, I grew up with the internet in my teenage years. The internet coming, but we just played internet pool when I had the internet. So I also grew up in a rural community, 800 people. I remember dial up. Some people might think that's dubstep music. If you know what dubstep music is, just that. So with all of my stand-up comedy aside, I think a few things that we have to look at the type of generation that Gen Z is. Now, Gen Z has occurred at least 3 previous times in what I call the American experience. So from the time that the Pilgrims landed in North America to present day, we've had about 3 previous Gen Z generations. I call these generations the adaptive artist. And typically, these adaptive artist generations, they are the bookend of a generational cycle. So there's 4 generations that happen, and you go through the same 4. So you have baby boomers, you have Gen X, you have millennials, you have Gen Z, and then it repeats. And at the end of the show, we can talk about who the new baby boomers are. Just remind me if you want to cover that. So, but what ends up happening is Gen Z is the bookend, and they live in the shadows of millennial type generations. And they tend to not have a great influence on the history of America and where America is going. That could change. There could be a shift in that, and I'm becoming more open to Gen Z being a more impactful generation. Still a little skeptical, but typically what prohibits a Gen Z generation from having a lot of impact is exactly what we are seeing today. Most Gen Z generations grow up over-parented. And in that over-parenting, Jonathan Haidt would call it a coddling of the American mind, if you've ever read that book or listened to it. And I use the example of a caterpillar in a chrysalis or a cocoon, in that caterpillar's in the cocoon, it metamorphosizes into a butterfly, and it starts like working its way out of the cocoon. Now, if I came by and said, God, it's just breaking my heart to see this caterpillar struggle so much, I'm just going to take my pocket knife and make a little slit to help it get out of the cocoon. I don't want to see it struggle. What will happen is when that butterfly emerges from that cocoon, it'll actually fall to the ground and eventually die. And my desire to help and alleviate the burden of escaping that cocoon has actually damned the butterfly, because it needed the stress of escaping the cocoon to strengthen its wings so it can fly away. And there are many authors and experts out there, you don't have to take my word for it, that would say we think we have seen this with Gen Z. The overparenting that began with millennials, and again, as I was doing my research and working on my dissertation, I was like, oh my gosh, I was overparented by my baby boomer parents. And so I see it, and that trend starts with a millennial generation and grows with a Gen Z generation. So we're seeing that. So to answer your question about being in the workforce, I think that because Gen Z was overparented, and Gen Z is like that caterpillar and wondering, do I have what it takes to succeed in life? I think there is a desire for further parenting in the workplace. Gen Z wants mentors, they want guides to help them learn how to be professionals. And if you're working from home and you've lived digitally most of your life, then I think you are probably thinking, I need to be in a physical workplace where I can glean from people who are experts and know more than me and are professionals. So I think from the research that I have seen, that is what is driving a lot of Gen Z to want to be in the workplace. And also they have a desire to succeed and to be directed and given guidance. So one of the things that I developed in my dissertation process was the ability for Gen Z to, was the ability for leaders to learn how to develop Gen Z in the workplace, and to be aware that this is going to be a different learning and working style that you're going to need to use in order to develop your Gen Z employees. So I think that's what it is. I think Gen Z has a desire for more parenting. It just is expressed in a different form in the workplace.
I had never considered that. So that is astonishing. That's a very interesting point. The metaphor, I guess, that you brought up of the butterfly makes sense, because other I don't know if I want to call them analogies that I've heard are of, I believe it's lobsters, how they, in order to shed their exoskeleton, need to face some stress or anxiety before they crawl behind a rock, shed their outer layer so that they can then grow into it. So it's a force of being faced with some external anxiety stressor that allows them to grow. Or to take a, I guess, darker example, the way that pest control works, specifically for termites, is the chemical substance. What it does is that it inhibits the exoskeleton of the termites from shedding, from molting. Okay. So the termite itself keeps growing, but because the skin does not, it explodes. So I think that you bring up an excellent point of that. The entire point of the human experience is growth, but we require that external stress or anxiety in order to grow. If we try to stop it, we hinder ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, and I had not considered the, I guess, proxy parenting that a job or a workplace could have.
Yeah.
Not entirely. I guess that kind of makes me a little more conscious of all of the job ads that say we're like a family. I've never liked those, full disclosure. I think that workplaces and families are...
It's interesting you say that, because I used to work at a university in Oklahoma, and I was on LinkedIn, and I saw pictures of their student orientation. And I, years ago, revamped that student orientation, changed the theme and everything. And so I was like, oh, let me just check in and see what they're doing now. Like, I'm just really curious, like, how are they doing it now? And I saw signs that said, welcome home. And I was talking with my father-in-law about it, because he and I and my wife, we all went to the same university, just at different times, obviously. And I said, a novel idea in higher education right now would be college is a place to learn. I'll let that sink in just for a second. College is a place to learn. And so I'm telling him about this sign that says, welcome home. I said, that is one of the challenges with Gen Z, is that we're not, those of us who are older are not giving them a chance to leave home. We are continuing some of the behaviors that have inhibited a generation. And when you do this, you increase anxiety. Like, there's plenty of studies out there that show that college students have higher levels of anxiety today compared to previous generations. So the issue is do I have what it takes to succeed? I don't know, because my millennial parents have been snowplows in my life. They go before me, they clear the way. As a millennial, we had helicopter parents. Gen Z has more snowplow parents, and they just make things simpler and easier. On top of that, you have a generation that is incredibly digitally connected, and so there are studies that have started to emerge, and even employees, like, I'm seeing more dissertation topics on the lack of soft skills that Gen Z have going into the workplace. And so there's nonverbal behaviors and identifiers that some Gen Z aren't picking up on, or they're not exhibiting because they've been so digitally connected. And so you have these things that make like a really good snowball for challenges. But, I remember I was talking with the CEO of a book company located here in the area, and he's complaining about millennials and Gen Z and all this stuff. And I think I just got tired of it. And I looked at him, I said, well, you raised us. What did you expect? And he just got like really quiet, probably killed a book deal for me saying that. But no, like we are, as you're familiar with Jean Twenge, at this point in my career, I don't know if she coined this term or I coined this term. So we should probably give her credit for it, but the term growing up more slowly. And so Gen Z just emotional maturation tends to grow up more slowly. And I think we're seeing that because we're continuing ideas like, oh, you're going off to college, welcome home. Okay, no, it should be you're going off to college, welcome to college. It's time to do a lot of maturing in 4 to 5 years. Like that's where we should have our younger students thinking like, hey, we're really going to work on this maturation thing over the next 4 to 5 years. So those are my thoughts on it. Again,
I think you're absolutely correct on the process of college being a learning and maturing experience more so than the next step in just enjoying life and figuring it out as you go. No, college should be hard, not just for the sake of the academics of intentionally making it burdensome, but the sense of being an independent person, understanding what that's like to not have ingrained support systems in place, needing to be self-sufficient and autonomous as a human being, being self-reliant. So in cases of turmoil, some difficulty, you can rely on yourself to carry yourself out of it. And I absolutely agree with you on that function. Pivoting back to an earlier point, it was the baby boomers and the wealth that they're either spending or they have accumulated through their lifetime of retiring, saving, whatever it is. I believe that is now a topic that has been covered, not quite ad nauseum, but repeatedly over the last month or two, the impending biggest wealth transfer in human history, with I believe the number that says 75 billion, I want to say, that will be transferred from the boomers to, let's say, the Gen X's or the older millennials. And I think that is a fascinating topic because we're not really talking about it yet. We're starting to broach the subject about how a lot of boomers now are either retired or already passing on, and how that wealth that has been accumulated will be transferred to another generation. And on a quick side note, I do find it kind of ironic that we have a name for the boomers and a name for the millennials. Then there's Gen X and Gen Z. I don't like calling Gen Z the Zoomers. I would prefer to call us the iGen. I think that's a good name. I don't know what we call Gen X though. I legitimately, they're the other forgotten generation.
There was a term, but it got overpowered by two guys, Strauss and Howe. They wrote a book in 1990-91 called Generations, and I think they coined Gen X, and they won the nomenclature war with that generation. I prefer their designation, which is cavalier nomads. I think that's much more descriptive of who they are, like, and even their ethos of, we feel like we're kind of rebellious and unwanted and, things like that. That tends to fit more in their ethos than just Gen X. And I'm hearing people call the next generation Gen Alpha. And I'm like, that is incredibly unimaginative. Like, can we try a little harder, guys? Just a little harder.
We ran out of English letters, so we switched to Greek letters.
Right.
I feel bad for the generation called Gen Beta, because then we've also all the self-help books that don't want you to be a beta. Oh man, those if we stick to this, an entire generation of literally beta men. I don't envy them at that point.
I'll tell you at the end of the show, I'll tell you what I call the next generation and why. So it'd be great. Be much better.
As for the I would hope so. But as for the wealth transfer, I think that is an interesting point that we need to really investigate, because as you're mentioning, the topic of retirement savings is still largely under-discussed in normal circles, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. A lot of people left the markets. They were scared out of it, and they just went back to trying to save themselves to retirement. So how do you see that transition going, or what are your thoughts on it?
That's a great question. So when the crash of 2020 happened, my cousin she messaged me and was freaking out and was like, should I just pull everything out? And I was like, you do not pull anything out of your account. I know that you've seen it tank. Don't touch it. Leave it exactly where it's at. Now, thank God she listened to me, and she's doing just fine today. And that is the nature of mutual funds and retirement plans, is that they are built in a way that even if the market takes a dip or even, some type of recessionary period, historically, you're going to make at least 10% on the market. That's the way it's been for the last, I think, 40 years, maybe a little longer, at least since the end of the Great Depression. So the trends are on your side when it comes to that. So with baby boomers, this would be great to look up, but most baby boomers, I would venture to say, their wealth is tied up in their home. And so when my father-in-law works with people with reverse mortgages and gets them a percentage of their home in cash for them to use, and then they don't have to make any more payments on their home. All they have to do is make sure the property taxes and insurance on the house are covered, and they can live there till the day they die. There is baby boomers who are taking that up because they are out of liquid cash in order to fund their lifestyle. So my guess is a lot of the transfer is going to be when a parent passes away and somebody has to sell the house. Now, the majority, Gen Xers, millennials, they don't want to inherit a house. They don't want to have to deal with selling it or anything like that. So my guess is that's where the wealth transfer will occur, is in like real estate, like a physical asset that has to be liquidated. Gen X is feeling the crunch of retirement, especially, as I said, they're taking care of their elderly parents who are either from the lost generation or early baby boomers, and then they're also trying to take care of their teenage children. Again, I don't think anybody planned on people starting to live this long. Back in 50s, 60s, living to the ripe old age of 60-ish, that was an accomplishment. Living to your 80s now, whoa, who would have ever imagined? So definitely some big transitions. Gen Z appears to be the most personal finance savvy generation that we've seen, like in their age location. So let's just say 18 to 25. They are more financially savvy than millennials 18 to 25, Gen X 18 to 25, baby boomers 18 to 25. But this has to do more with saving money and not spending money on superfluous expenditures, things like that. When it comes to the topic of investing, like actually investing, Gen Z is still lost on that topic now. And I would venture to say that most people are lost on the topic of investing. So I think that's where Gen Z is sitting is, hey, we budget. We live within our means. We're doing the things that we need to do. But I think every Gen Z should read George Clayson's The Richest Man in Babylon. It's one of my favorite finance books. Have you read it, Gabriel?
I have not.
You need to read it. It's a little short novella. It's like 100 pages, something like that. And it talks about how to take what you've saved and put it into things that will generate money for you, and things that you should keep in mind. And it's written from this perspective of an ancient Babylonian society. And it's just a lot of fun. I think you would enjoy it. But when it comes to the investing component, that is where Gen Z appears to be missing that piece.
I think that you bring up an interesting point on both fronts, on the saving and the investing side of it, where the saving front, this is an assumption having not done the research, but I would assume that a significant portion of that, beyond having seen their parents struggle, is also having heard all the stereotypes about millennials. You know, those darn millennials going out, spending, clubbing, whatever, all the other fun things, and going, we don't want to be them.
Yeah, yeah.
For the love of God, we don't want being a Gen Z to be as stereotypically joked about as being a millennial.
Yeah.
I know. I grew up with that. I'm like, those darn millennials. I'm younger than you, but I don't want to be you. You've ruined it for the rest of us.
We are the best generation. I just don't want any of your listeners to forget that. But yes, those darn millennials. That's absolutely true.
So I think that you were absolutely correct on that front. And the investing side, Robinhood. I remember I was in high school when that, I don't even know if it was a Twitter post or an email that came out where it was, you know, launching, you know, commission-free trading platform. And then it didn't come out for another year. It was just a sign up. And I think a million or so people had enrolled in it. A good portion of them, my classmates.
Yeah.
I was like, what is this? What are we doing? And I remember getting on the platform and I go, okay, user interface is beautiful.
Sure.
It's lovely to look at.
Mm-hmm.
But where's the functionality here?
Right.
It feels like a game, which is precisely what they've now been accused of kind of gamifying investing, where invite a friend, refer them, post about it on stock twits, you know, follow Dave Portnoy on Twitter, whatever it is, and going, wait, no, where's the research capabilities?
Well, and, you know, to your point, I mean, this is an anecdotal story, but there was a young person who committed suicide because they did not understand. I think it was a margin call that happened.
If I know that
Robinhood,
I know that
so they woke up and saw they were $500,000 in debt and killed
and stepped in front of a train.
Yeah,
correct. I wrote about this story as well, where the account, I believe it was an options trade that they were in the negative on. That's why they were in debt, those hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. For those that are loosely unaware of how options trades work, if the underlying asset does not go the way you expect it to, it can expire worthless. That is the way that an options trade should work if it goes against you. However, because of the way that the Robinhood system worked, it showed as him being hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Yeah. And this young man, I believe he was 19. I believe his name was Alex. I could have been. He was very young. In his mind, he'd emailed the Robinhood support team a couple of times, was getting nothing, and he was being bombarded with messages of, you need to deposit an absurd amounts of cash. And he, in his mind, wanting to save his parents the stress of filing for bankruptcy and all of the other things, stepped in front of a train, and then literally an hour and a half later got an alert from Robinhood saying, oh, your account is cleared.
Yeah.
And my reasons for not liking Robinhood, again, I've disparaged them marginally in this podcast. I have many reasons to not like them. But I think that's one of the major reasons, is they made investing a game. It was exciting, but they didn't really focus on the foundations, the framework of an investing platform. Yes. Whereas literally anything else, Fidelity, Thinkorswim by TD Ameritrade, E-Trade, whatever it is, have internal educational videos, other frameworks involved that you can look up stocks, look at news stories. Robinhood, it might have changed in the years since I've used it for research purposes, was lacking in that sense. It was just beautiful to look at. You could integrate it with different social media sites. It was great. And I think that because, especially with the meme stock plays the last year and a half or so, a lot of younger I don't want to call them investors, because meme plays are not investing. They're, FOMO, but on a broader scale.
Yeah. I mean, if you take that typical Benjamin Graham approach, like there's a difference between an investor and a speculator. And really, we have not had investors in this like red hot market from 2020 until recently. It's been a ton of speculation. And so that has helped drive the market. So yeah, I agree with you on that.
It has driven the market, and I think this was news that broke 2 days ago. The CFO of Bed Bath & Beyond, the original story was fell from the Jenga tower in New York. Now they're saying that he jumped, and news I think broke earlier today that he's being investigated for a pump and dump scheme involving Bed Bath & Beyond, which is one of the bigger meme stock plays in the last year and a half.
Interesting. Okay.
So far unconfirmed. That's just news that's evolving as we go. I just remember I got the news 2 days ago.
Sure.
Labor Day vacation with my family and went, how do you fall out of a building? It's possible, but something doesn't feel right to me.
There's a lot of effort to fall out of a building.
There's an effort to fall out of a very tall building that I'm sure has guardrails in place on your balconies, whatever it is.
Right.
Something doesn't feel kosher to me, but whatever it is. And AMC as well. They had the CEO, was it, that had sold millions of stock and then stepped down, and now they released new stock, and that went absolutely down the drain. Yeah. So these meme plays were purely FOMO driven. It was Wall Street bets kind of taking control of the market, and everyone going to the moon, and then it went to the moon and then back down.
It's changed. I don't know if changed or maybe added to the idea of an activist investor. So an activist investor would be somebody historically like Warren Buffett, but there's plenty of examples today where they find a stock that is undervalued because it's underperforming, and they're able to buy a large chunk of it. So Elon Musk would be somebody that would be an activist investor with the whole Twitter debacle. But what happened with Reddit and the meme stocks and the hedge funds, at the end of the day, I'm all for it. I think that is how free markets should continue to work, that these things can and should go unregulated, because once you regulate these things, there's only one winner, and that's hedge funds and politicians who are dumb enough to believe the hedge funds. So I'm a big proponent of let's keep the markets as free as possible. But again, that's speculation. It's not investing. I remember this summer, my wife and I, we bought some Amazon stock in anticipation of the split. And so, we sat down and we talked through our finances. I'm like, I really think we should buy this Amazon stock. Here's my reasons why. Are you good with this? So we made the decision together. We're good with it. And a sister of one of my wife's friends is studying finance at a university. And so my wife is telling her, yeah, we bought Amazon. And she goes, well, why did you buy Amazon? Well, it's going to split into 20, et cetera, et cetera. She goes, well, Robinhood will sell you fractional shares. And I'm like, you should know. You should know better than to give me that answer as a finance student. And there's some rudimentary things here, but yeah. So again, I think it's the investing component that is investing versus speculating that Gen Z just hasn't put that puzzle piece in yet.
Absolutely. So to kind of bring this all full circle and to wrap us up, how do you think that they can go about, adding in that final missing piece to their financial savvy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, and thank you for asking it. I think one of the best things Gen Z can do, and we'll give some examples, because whether they choose to go to college or not, going to college doesn't guarantee a job, doesn't guarantee a lucrative job. What I would say is wherever you're working, and let me also say, I'm a big proponent of the trades. I think more young people should be getting into trades, and there are tons of programs. Like here in Colorado Springs, we have Pikes Peak State College, and if you do 2 years there in a welding program, you get your welding kit, and you go and you're making $80,000 a year right off the bat. So I think there's a lot of great opportunities to succeed in America that doesn't involve college. And you're hearing that from a college professor. So with that said, I think one of the best things Gen Zer could do is, one, let's lean into that mentorship desirability component. Talk to some seasoned adults, people who are in their 50s and 60s, and ask about investing. Ask, did you invest through your company? Did you invest through something else? Then, I do not get paid for this. I am not I'm not sponsored. I'm not an influencer by any stretch of the imagination. But there are some great mutual funds like the Vanguard 500 that I think for $1,000, maybe it's $2,000 now, you can get started in. And I think that is one of the best routes that Gen Z can get into, especially if you're working at a coffee shop or, retail or restaurants, anything like that. Start now and discipline yourself to pay yourself first. And that's one of those principles. That's one of those principles in The Richest Man in Babylon is pay yourself first and take that money and put it in something you can't touch, like a Vanguard 500. And those funds are set up according to the Warren Buffett style. They track with Warren Buffett's investment style. And I think you're going to be very well served investing in something like that.
All right. Well, I appreciate the final bit of advice, not sponsored in any way, shape, or form.
No way, shape, or form.
The go-to advice seems to be index funds, by and large. I think that's advice that most, even professors, have given, where it's don't worry about picking individual stocks. Find an index fund that's low cost and invest in it. Figure it out, talk to people, go from there.
Yeah.
So, in closing out, so you have your Thursday Gen Z newsletters that go live on LinkedIn. Is there anyone else that people can find you, or is that the main place people can see your work?
I'm trying to hang out more on LinkedIn. So, yeah, please go there. My email address is Aaron, Aaron, at draaronbrown.com. So, draaronbrown.com. You can catch me there. So those would be the two places that I'm really hanging out at.
Absolutely, sir. And again, I thank you for coming on to the show. It's really interesting talking to you. I learned a few things. The parenting aspect of mentorship is something I will ponder for the rest of the day, if not into tomorrow. But I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone for tuning in. If it's your first time, welcome. If it's a repeat listener, I appreciate your coming back. I will talk to all of you on Friday. Have a good day. Thank you again.